Well, hello and welcome to this, our third session in our US election tour, looking at the key states and counties in the battle for the American presidency. Today, our focus is Fairfax County, Virginia. Why are we here? With over 1 million inhabitants, Fairfax is critical to the Dems' attempt to win the state, but perhaps more importantly, it's a barometer of the party's strength in places like it, the big metropolitan suburbs across America. We've got a great lineup of voters, experts, and party strategists to talk to us, about 8 guests in total. But without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Malcolm Brown, our reporter who is in Fairfax. Hello, Malcolm.
Hey, Nick, thanks for that. Well, we're outside the seat of Fairfax County government, a very large building. You could run a small city-state from it. That's an indication of quite how large a county this is and how prosperous a county it is. And what we're seeing over here is a line that's a little shorter than it was, but at one point it was about 100 yards long or so, made longer, of course, by the social distancing required by the current COVID emergency, but people are early voting here. It's one of 14 early voting sites in the county. But as Nick mentioned, we're really here to get a temperature of America's suburbs at the moment. And earlier on this morning, I delved into those suburbs to talk to a very interesting representative of a particular group that's very much in the public mind and the public conversation at the moment. Donald Trump has made the suburbs a key battleground in this election campaign, warning suburban voters that he's a bulwark against what he depicts as the violence, anarchy and dysfunction of Democrat-run cities. But that message doesn't appear to be working, with polling suggesting that Mr. Trump's support has declined in the suburbs, especially among women. The US president has been pleading with female suburban voters in response, saying things like, "Will you please like me? Please, please, I saved your damn neighborhood, okay?" So we've come to this suburb in Fairfax County to see how that message is playing out. As you can see, there are tidy family homes. It's a beautiful autumn day. Halloween decorations are out, lawns are being cut, you can probably hear in the background. It's all just a 30-minute drive to the White House in admittedly lighter than usual COVID traffic conditions. We've come here to meet one of the residents of this suburb who lives on this street. Okay, so we've come to speak to Karen Mahoney in the neighborhood. Karen, you describe yourself as a professional juggler, I think, so you're balancing the demands of raising 2 kids and in this COVID era, and also a professional life. You're also a voter, obviously. Now, you identify as a Democrat, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Have you voted yet?
Not yet. Filled out our absentee ballot, and it's just a matter of putting it in a drop-off location, so making sure that it's not mailed in, because I'm not quite sure how I feel about that right now.
Okay, fair enough. So Donald Trump is making this big play for suburban women voters. We are in a suburb, you're a woman.
I am.
How's that playing with you?
Not well. When he made a mass appeal and said that suburban women were all for him, it was the biggest joke for myself and a lot of my friends. It's, I think, a rather large assumption on his part, and I don't find much truth to it at all. I mean, you read it in the papers, and there's no proof to that. It was just an assumption on his part, and a very wrong one.
So we're here in this very pleasant suburb, just outside Washington, D.C. We're in Fairfax, Virginia, tidy homes, well-cut grass, you know, kind of a classic American suburb. Donald Trump has said his case essentially is, look, I'm protecting the suburbs from the chaos and the disaster that are the inner cities at the moment, with Black Lives Matter rioting, as he puts it, and so on. Is there any resonance to that message here?
No, and I think that's part of the issue, is that when he said that he appeals to the suburban woman, that he has this kind of racist ideology that suburban life is the picket fence, the man going to work and making the money, the wife staying at home, tending to the children, cooking the meals, a very whitewashed way of looking at suburban life, and that's just not the case. As you said, in our neighborhood, it's very diverse, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to move here. We love that. We want that for our children. That's a more idealistic way for our children to be raised. His view of the suburban life versus the reality is so far off, I would say, especially here.
It's pretty affluent. I mean, Fairfax always comes in and sort of among the top counties in the country, actually, in terms of median income. Does that maybe make it not a perfect analogy for the other suburbs, or do you think this is pretty illustrative of suburbs around the nation, just outside major cities?
Absolutely. I think, especially my demographic and my age group, we are looking for that balance, that having a nice neighborhood, but having it be diverse and inclusive, and especially outside those bigger cities. I think that's fair to say that you're seeing that more and more. Does that fit the mold for everybody? No, but in generalization, I would say that's true.
What are the issues that are motivating you right now?
So many. It always comes down to my children. So top of mind and biggest is environmental standards and regulations. I want to protect what we have, and we're just in this downward trend, and how he's taking apart the EPA.
That's the Environmental Protection Agency, for those who may not know.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
How he is breaking ties with worldwide organizations that only better the standards for how we approach the future. The way he treats women, the way he treats Black people, Indigenous people. There is a whole list that he is the antithesis of, and representation is not at all what matches for him.
Just finally, how confident are you? When I talk to Democrats, they seem to veer between sort of pent-up excitement and anticipation of a victory, and then abject panic that maybe this is going to be 2016 all over again. Where are you on that spectrum?
I think I'm still on the very much apprehensive, leaning more towards panic. I went into the 2016 election confident. I voted for Hillary Clinton, and based on the polls and the numbers and the things that I was seeing at the voting stations, I felt good about it. And then as the night progressed and watching the numbers come in, it was devastating. It's still devastating. So I don't trust the numbers. And now with all of the things going on in the media about Trump not believing the numbers, and especially the ballots, the absentee ballots as they're counted, I think I'm just setting myself up for a lot of chaos, and hopefully not disappointment, but I can't confidently say that I'm excited, which I wish I could.
Karen, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
So that was Karen Mahoney there, talking to us as a all-important representative of this vital voting bloc in this election, a female suburban voter. For the kind of professional class perspective, I went and talked to Ben Tribbett, who is a strategist and activist on the Democratic Party side, again, who works the machinery of these elections and has had many years' experience doing so. We are now in the center of Fairfax County, and we're with Ben Tribbett, who is a Democratic political consultant, longtime activist as well. I think it's probably fair to say, worked on lots of campaigns, a veteran of this kind of business. So we're just going to take a little look around town and talk a little bit about what we're seeing. Tell us a little bit about the county. I mean, it's obviously epitomized a bit by what we see around town. I'm getting a bit of a sort of antebellum feel to it, but it's also, in a way, surprisingly diverse. There's a Uyghur restaurant just around the corner, right?
Right. I mean, Fairfax County has been becoming more and more diverse over the last 40 years. It used to be a mostly white county in the suburbs of Washington that voted Republican, voted for Reagan, voted for Bush. Last election that we voted Republican in was 2000 for George W. Bush. And since then it's become a Democratic county. And every cycle it gets about 5 points more Democratic. So John Kerry got 55 here, Barack Obama broke 60, Hillary Clinton broke into the high 60s, and we expect this year Joe Biden may get up to 75% of the vote.
And it's pretty affluent too, right? I mean, it's always listed Fairfax as one of the most affluent median incomes in the country.
Right. It has one of the most affluent, and all of the neighbors that are around Fairfax County are also on that list. Northern Virginia is a very affluent area. It has a large federal presence here, and between the federal contracting and then the tech industry, it really drives the local economy.
Okay, so you're talking about this constantly expanding Democratic majority here. So it's not a huge nail biter, but what do we look out for? What are the indicators that you might pick up on here that would indicate what's going on nationally?
Yeah, so Fairfax County is really very much symbolic of what's going on around the rest of the country. We're doing political campaigns in all sorts of areas, and the Democratic Party is really making gains among affluent suburban voters everywhere. And you're seeing, whether it's the Atlanta suburbs or whether it's the suburbs in Texas, even historically red states are becoming more and more competitive because of their suburban influence. And Fairfax County is a good example of what's going on there. Virginia, which used to be a competitive swing state, is no longer really that competitive because it's become so suburban that the Republicans just can't even keep up here anymore.
Obviously, Donald Trump has made this very high-profile play for suburban votes, especially for suburban women, where he's been doing pretty badly. Do you get any sense that he's had traction with that? The polls would seem to suggest no.
I think that Trump is, I think people have decided on Trump for a while. I think the Republican Party has been trying to really soften with those voters for the down ballot races. They're hoping that they can convince people that if they can, soften Trump's image a little bit to try to save some of their local and congressional seats, because they've been just bloodied in the suburbs now for the last 4 years, cycle after cycle. These suburban voters are just annihilating Republicans everywhere.
And as a portion of the national vote, where are the suburbs heading? Presumably they're not getting any smaller, right?
Right, that's where all of the growth is. And so we're seeing, in Virginia, for example, Fairfax County, Northern Virginia, was about 32% of the electorate 8 years ago. It's going to be closer to 40% of the electorate now. All of the growth is coming in these areas. And that's what's happening in every state in the country, whether it's the, again, Atlanta suburbs or the Texas suburbs, or any other state that's sort of trending from red to blue, Arizona, for example. It's all happening in the suburbs around major cities. And it's all happening among well-educated, higher-income voters that are historically Republican on tax issues, but that just can't stand Donald Trump and this modern Republican Party.
What are the motivating issues here? Or is this just, as you may be suggesting, a referendum on the personality and the worldview of Donald Trump?
I think there's trend lines that are happening, and it's not just in the United States, it's actually worldwide, where you're seeing different things happening across the world. I mean, I think of we cover and have worked on races, all over the world, and these upper income voters that are historically Republican, conservative, whatever, are all trending away from that ideology everywhere. And so we even saw it in the recent UK election when the seat around Wimbledon went to the Labour Party for the first time in 200 years. It's just a national trend here, but it's really worldwide. You're seeing the same thing happen in the Canadian election, same thing happened, where the Liberal Party was picking up ground in affluent suburbs. And I just think that this new generation cares more about issues like climate change and social issues than they do just about their pocketbook. And tax issues and revenue issues just don't play anymore as a reason to vote for incompetent policy. And it's so that these well-educated voters that follow these things day to day are the people trending away. And the lower information voters are the ones who are trending towards the Republicans. They're the ones who have been locked out of some of these opportunities, and they have, a lot of anger towards the establishment. And those are the people that Donald Trump's picking up votes from. The problem is there just aren't enough of them. And there aren't enough of them in these key states, and especially these historically Republican states. A place like Texas, for example, should be Republican on paper. But if you lose the suburbs completely around Dallas and Houston, the state's going to become competitive very fast. And I think that we've seen the last cycle. If Donald Trump's able to carry Texas this year, this will be the last year the Republican Party will carry Texas for the foreseeable future.
So let that sink in. That's really extraordinary if that's true and that it's borne out by this election. So clearly this election is enormously consequential, but the tectonic sort of seismic stuff that's going on under the surface as well is really going to be important going into the future, the demographic shifts, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, just to repeat what Ben Tribbett was saying at the end of that interview, he was saying that he thinks because of the growth of the suburbs, that Texas, which has been the bastion of Republican states for a very, very long time, since the 60s, would be likely to go to the Democrats in the next cycle and for the foreseeable future, which is a huge shift. And this is why we're looking at Fairfax County, part of a metropolitan suburb, part of Washington, although it's got a lot of federal jobs in it. It's the symbolism here. If the same thing is happening in Fairfax across the United States, that's very significant in this election, but also in future elections. We've got two Democratic strategists, in fact, the heads of the Democratic Party in Fairfax County very shortly. But before we go to them, we're going to speak with Professor Stephen Farnsworth, who's a professor of political science at the University of Mary Washington, and he's going to take us through some of the changes that have been taking place in Virginia that show that shift towards the Democrats. Stephen, you go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to show you, to start off, three maps that give you a sense of how Virginia shakes out, for those of you not familiar with the state. What I have here, and this is a project that I've been working on with Professor Stephen Hanna in the University of Mary Washington Geography Department, where we're trying to think about politics visually. It's an important way to reach students these days in terms of these images. And so this can give you a sense of what Virginia looks like. The dark blue area on this map was the most Democratic jurisdiction, that you had an overwhelming support for the Democratic candidate for governor in the 2017 election. You see lighter blue for areas where the Democrats won, but not by as much, and then the reverse for the Republicans. The darker red, the more Republican jurisdictions. And so you have a very, very conservative Southwest and South Side Virginia, as well as a rural area along the western edge of the state that really is the core of Republican voting. But but what's happening in Virginia is a significant movement away from the Republican Party, not just in the suburbs like Fairfax County, but elsewhere. Now, Fairfax County on this map is sort of at the upper right of this corner. I've got the next map, I have it identified, but basically what we have here is it's one of the darker blue, but not the darkest blue jurisdictions. And so if we go to the next map, I want to show you the way that this looks when you compare people voting. You see, acres don't vote, people do. And what this map does is it adjusts the size of the jurisdictions in Virginia for the number of votes cast there. And so if you flip between the first map and the second map, you see that if you're a Republican, this is a very appealing map. There's a lot of red here. But if you move to the second map, you see that, in fact, those red jurisdictions that look so prominent when we considered acres, those don't match up with where the voters are. And so in this map, you see just how big Northern Virginia is. Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, those areas at the top of the slide are huge share of the votes cast within the total statewide electorate. Similarly, you have areas that are also more urban around Virginia Beach and the Hampton Roads area, and then, of course, around the city of Richmond. And so you have a reality here where the cities are very, very pro-democratic, but the suburbs, particularly the suburbs closest to the big cities, are quite democratic as well. And then the jurisdictions a little further afield, they are a little less democratic than the closer in suburbs. A third map shows you the change over time. And so what this map shows us is actually, if you're a Democrat, this is the map you're going to like the most. It shows the difference over the 4-year cycle for the one governor's election in 2013 and then the next one in 2017. And this doesn't show who won the jurisdiction. It shows who's gaining in the jurisdiction. And so a lot of the counties where Republicans still win, they're not winning by as much. And the way that you win statewide in Virginia, if you're a Republican, is you try to keep the margin close in the suburbs, you wrap up lots of big numbers in the rural areas, and you just hope that the urban areas are not too high in terms of turnout. So if you're looking at something like this, it really speaks to where the Republican Party is in terms of national preferences as well, because one of the things that we know about Virginia, when you look at the demographics of the state, we're a state that actually looks a lot like the rest of the country. If you were to pick one of the most representative states in the country in terms of the percentage of people who are college educated, or the percentage of population that is African American or Latino. If you're looking at all of these kinds of dynamics, Virginia is actually a pretty close match to the country as a whole. We have a Sun Belt in Virginia Beach. We have a high-tech corridor in Northern Virginia. We have a conservative religious heartland in Southwest and Southside Virginia. We have mining, we have industry. And so we are not a bad microcosm for the country as a whole. Now, I want to show you a couple of quick data slides here before I turn it over to the next panelist. We are less of a swing state in 2020, according to the polls. And I think that has to do with the nature of the Republican message that is being offered. I think the Donald Trump presidency is very good at connecting with the base, those Christian conservative voters who are really going to be motivated by questions of issues relating to abortion. The idea of keeping the suburbs white, which is sort of the sotto voce nature of what's actually being offered by the Trump campaign, is not a message that resonates in the suburbs of today. It may have been much more useful in the 1970s. It's the strategy that Richard Nixon employed back in the day, but the suburbs of Richard Nixon's time were much, much whiter than the suburbs of today. And so as you look at what has happened in Virginia, in the US Senate race, for example, the last time Mark Warner was on the ballot, he won by 1 point. The polls right now show him ahead by a big double-digit margin. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the state by 5 points. But right now, Donald Trump is far, far behind Joe Biden, according to the surveys. Now, I've given you 3 congressional races that these are districts that the Republicans won in 2016, and they lost 2 of them in 2018, and they may lose the 3rd one in 2020. These are Republican districts drawn through gerrymandering to elect a Republican, but with the growing diversity of the suburban areas, it becomes harder and harder for the Republicans to win. To give you a sense of where these are in Virginia, let's go to the next slide. This is the map of Virginia with a congressional district. And the Fairfax County district is the 11th district and the 10th district. And there's a little sliver of the 8th district as well, but it's that area at the right close to DC where we're talking about. The conversation when you're turning to Falk here is at the very northern end of the purple district, the 5th district, which is drawn to elect a Republican. As you can see, it contains a lot of rural counties. The other district I mentioned on the slide, the 2nd district, is at the very bottom right of the slide. That's the Virginia Beach area. In terms of how things have changed, let's go to the next slide. You can see here just how the Trump messaging for Republicanism has really not worked so well in the midterm election. If you look at the 2016 congressional margin, you compare that to the 2018 margin, you can see across the board in districts that are more Republican or more competitive, Donald Trump has cost Republicans in the range of, on balance, 10 points or so in districts even that are overwhelmingly Republican, like the 1st district, which includes Fredericksburg, where I am. The reality here in Virginia politics is that a more effective Republican message will be essential for the Republicans to win statewide. Republicans have not won a statewide election in Virginia since 2009. And when they did, the candidate for governor focused on economic issues, not the social conservative agenda that works in terms of the, quote, Bible Belt part of the country. These are not suburban voters who are going to answer to that kind of call in great numbers. I have one more slide to show you that talks about how Fairfax County has really changed. As you heard in that last segment, this is a district that is becoming more and more diverse, a county that is becoming more and more Democratic. Right now, the estimate is that the white population of Fairfax County is about 2/3 of the population. It was much higher in the past. But right as you look at the Democratic vote, I've got some governors and presidential elections. You can see that the 2000 election where George W. Bush was elected, that's when Fairfax was still more Republican than not. But as the years have gone by, it has gotten increasingly Democratic. And that's bad news for a Republican trying to win statewide because the population is growing here. This is a place where people want to live. The area is more diverse. It has more young people. And so the idea that people are moving to the suburbs because of school busing or something is a message that's 40 years out of date. I've got some numbers here for Fauquier. I know you're going to be looking at that tomorrow. That hasn't had as much growth. It's not as big a place. It's a much wider place. And the percentage of Democratic vote in those jurisdictions is much more stable and much more Republican. That reality, though, is not all that impactful at the statewide level. Remember, 72,000 or so people call Fauquier home compared to almost 1.2 million in Fairfax.
Stephen,
I know I have to move quickly, so I thought I would hand it back to you, Nick, if that's
thank you. We have one more slide here, which just reinforced what you're saying, and this was from the New York Times, which talk about the ethnic diversity, increasing ethnic diversity of the suburbs around DC, and Fairfax is in the middle there, and you can see the between 1990 to 2017. We thought we'd just add that to your slides there. Stephen, thank you very much for that. You do stay on the line, and you can put your questions to Stephen later in the show, in the program. Next up, we've got two of the key people in the Democratic Party in Fairfax County. We've got Brian Graham, who's the committee chair, and we've got Jack Corrali, who's the executive director. So if I can, Brian, how are you? Where are you at the moment?
I'm at home at the moment, but I'm doing great, thank you.
Great, excellent. How are things going? Can you just give us an idea of of early voting? You know, what are your projections at the moment? Are you doing polling? What's your what feeling do you get at the moment?
Yeah, well, so I mean, obviously, we look at the numbers of who's voting, how many people are voting, and one of the things that we've done with the Democratic majority in Virginia is we've kind of opened early voting so that it's more accessible to people. If you look at 6 years ago, Virginia was ranked 49th out of the 50 states in access to voting, and now we're something like 12th out of all the states. So the dramatic improvements through Democratic leadership that we have kind of open up opportunities. You used to have an excuse to vote early. If you were sick, you're going to be out of town, whatever. But now you don't. Now there are no reasons, right? And where Malcolm is, there have been huge lines. If you look at national media, probably even international media, I'm sure you've seen a picture of the Fairfax County Government Center with lines of people. Now that we've opened up locations across the county, we have people kind of everywhere. So every day we have probably about 15 to 18,000 people voting at our satellite locations right now. And of course, there have already been more than 100, I think about 120,000 votes by mail, absentee ballots as well. So we look at all the numbers on Democratic scores and polling. Obviously we talk about, or Ben and whoever else can talk about how confident we are. We are very confident in Fairfax County and in Virginia having a huge Democratic victory just based off of everything that we're seeing.
Okay, let's bring in Jack. Jack, when we did two shows in Pennsylvania, and one of the key concerns there was what was going to happen to those ballots as they were counted, because with a very narrow contest there was concern that all those votes are gonna matter. That's not the concern with you. You're not worried. Has there been contentions about postal ballots? Have you had any of those issues at all?
I mean, I think there has been a consistent sort of latent fear over this entire cycle that the Trump administration or something was going to happen with the Postal Service, that ballots weren't going to arrive on time. But something that Brian mentioned, the new Democratic majority in Richmond, they had a special session. So part-time legislature, the governor called them back for a special session to address a number of issues, including the election. And how it's the intersection with COVID-19. And one of the reforms that they implemented was to actually extend a lot of these early voting opportunities. And one of the things that was included, this was earlier in the year, was an extension of the amount of time you could return your ballot. So it still has to be postmarked or dropped off at a ballot box, which was a new development in this special session. But you can, if your ballot is postmarked by 7 p.m. on election night, it can still arrive for about 72 more hours after that and still be counted. So a lot of the fears surrounding this have sort of not really come to bear here in Fairfax County. And I mean, we do enough direct mail pieces. Brian can attest that we test the Postal Service pretty frequently, and the response time, 2 to 3 days to get anywhere in the county is pretty good.
Yeah.
And that's what we've been seeing over the last couple months.
Okay, I'm interested, both of you, how representative do you think Fairfax is as a sort of a new American suburb? I mean, we've heard about the diversity, but also, I mean, you've got a heavy federal government presence. I'm just trying to make the contrast. Is the same thing really happening with you as it is in parts of Texas or other parts of the country which might be more Republican?
Well, I mean, I always kind of say Fairfax County is kind of the counterexample to the classical suburb is failing or a problem or is under attack or whatever. Fairfax County in the 90s 1990 was just over 80% white. And now we're much closer to 60%, almost at 60%. We kind of became a kind of international location for people to come focus. And a lot of that was because of our focus on schools, educational opportunities. Fairfax County has a very kind of highly educated workforce and populace as well. So I don't know that we're completely representative of the rest of the country. And I would also say that kind of Donald Trump's attacks on the federal workforce, on federal workers in general, doesn't really kind of speak well to the people that live here and either work for the government directly or work for companies that help support the government. So I don't know that Fairfax County is a complete connection to what's happening in the suburbs, but I will say that suburban growth and Fairfax County even has urban pockets now as well. Turns into kind of democratic performance. I mean, we can see that kind of clearly, however way you look at it.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, thank you very much indeed, Jack and Brian. If you've got the time, do stay on. I know you're busy people. You've got an election campaign to run, so I understand if you do have to do other things as well. In a moment, we're going to speak to Eduardo Conde, who works with the Puerto Rican community, which is quite sizable in Fairfax and just outside that area of Washington. But before we do that, I want to speak to a voter. Her name is Teresa Termine. And Teresa, you're there. I think you're on the line. How are you doing, Teresa?
I'm great. Thank you. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us just very briefly, how did you vote in 2016?
I voted Republican and have voted Republican virtually my whole life.
Okay. And last time around, what were your motivations? What were your concerns? What prompted you to vote for President Trump?
So I had a lot of mental gymnastics going into that vote. I was not a supporter or fan of President Trump or of Donald Trump at the time, and was very concerned about his attacks on women as the mother of 2 daughters. And that bothered me greatly in terms of casting my vote. But I took a look at the issues and the economy, and I believe in smaller government, that big government doesn't effectively solve problems, that government closer to the people is more effective. I was concerned about our debt and foreign relations. So I very hesitantly and not too proudly casted that vote. My daughters at the time were extremely upset with me because as a matter of course, they felt that I should vote for a woman because I am a woman and that would have been the right thing to do. So it was an interesting time for me to really challenge myself. But I felt at the end, being a Republican and believing in fiscal responsibility, that's the way I cast my vote.
Yeah. Okay. So how have the last 4 years gone for you? And what's happening this time?
So what's happened in the last 4 years has said to me I should have trusted my gut and not voted for someone I didn't respect. I have been extremely upset and appalled by the attacks upon women, upon race. I mean, the blatant racism coming out of this White House deeply upsets me. The lack of any personal responsibility or leadership coming from the White House deeply upsets me. I don't see any leadership. I don't see any even political philosophy or adherence to any sort of economic model. I think he goes where the wind blows. I think he's erratic. I don't particularly think he's rational. I think he is undermined our position on the world stage in a way that may never be, we may never regain our status in the world. And I find it embarrassing. My vote this election will be not because I think the Democratic Party is offering the best alternative. I think it is a good alternative. We have a solid person who has been in government, who understands, has a philosophy, and is surrounded by people who will give him true facts, not what he wants to hear. I cannot, in good conscience, find a way to vote for Donald Trump. And I'm really hopeful that this country will take us back to a place where we can be proud of the race baiting, the women hating. I'm so dismayed and disheartened by where we are today.
And have you got friends and colleagues who would have been Republicans before and maybe conservative as small c, the kind of people who do believe in small government, the people who've had distrust in the Democratic Party? I mean, what's the feeling of people around you?
It's really interesting. It's definitely split. I have many friends who worked in the George W. Bush White House and in politics, and a large number of them are very quietly organizing and working to make sure Biden wins. Some of them worked in the Trump White House and were absolutely dismayed by what they saw and the lack of leadership and the lack of coherent policy. So I see a lot of people feeling that way. Alternatively, I have a group of friends who feel very strongly that party above all, and that we can work to change from within, but to allow the Democrats to take over the White House and perhaps the Senate, that would lead us down a path of economic disaster or social welfare that they don't believe in. So it really is interesting whether someone believes in their philosophy and it's party above all, or whether someone is looking at where we are now and recognizing a need for change. We've had some very heated dinner parties. And so some people, this has become a very personal election for people. I have friends who don't talk to each other anymore. It's upsetting in many ways. Okay. I'm very worried about what happens November 4th.
It's a big question, isn't it? And I think that's something we're going to be looking at on November the 2nd, on the evening before the election. We'll be having a broadcast that looks more closely at the possibilities, what takes place after the election for the Republicans, the Democrats, no matter what the outcome of the election is. Is there a possibility of the US being less politically divided? Please do stay on the line, Teresa. That was a really, really interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Everyone, please start bringing your questions in. We'll open up the line so you can put your questions to people. We've just got one person to interview. We've got Eduardo. We're going to talk to Eduardo Conde in just a second. And we've also got Ben Tribbett, who you saw speaking with Malcolm earlier. Ben is here to answer your questions as well. So we'll come on to him in just a second too. But let me turn to Eduardo, and Malcolm, please do chip in. I know Malcolm's still there listening in. Eduardo, you work very closely with the Puerto Rican community. I just want to know, the Hispanic community is a massive block within the United States, but it's certainly not, it shouldn't be seen as just one voting block. It's more complex than that. So can you talk just a bit about the community that you work with, and then perhaps talk about trends across the states separate to that? Eduardo.
Yeah, sure. So I think you mentioned it very well. Like, it's the Latino community is not just one block. The issues that affect one community does not affect the other. I do work with the Puerto Rican community here in Washington, D.C. Metro. But I also work with other Latino communities as part of other work that I do in the areas of social justice. And it's very different. It's hard for me to speak about the Latino community as just one big entity, because the issues don't affect us all. For example, Puerto Ricans, we are American citizens. So the issue on immigration, it's not an issue that we identify with personally. And Puerto Rico being a colony of the US and having Hurricane Maria that happened 3 years and a couple of months ago, it's something that is still very present in our minds. It's something that we are still living it through. When we call home and we're talking to our relatives and their homes are not being rebuilt, and that we're having all the struggles that still remains even 3 years after, this is still very present, and it will be very present for this election. So for me to try to put everything in one big box is just as hard as it will be for any political strategist, I assume. The other communities that we have in our area, we have a huge Salvadorian community, a lot of Central Americans from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Bolivia. They have other issues that they care as well. Some of them, it came here, some of them were participants of DACA, and now they know what happened to DACA and all the things that put them in limbo. That is really gonna play an effect for us here in the county and all across the U.S. It's something that it's gonna have a huge impact. So yes, the Latino community, I think, will be a big deciding factors. I think that it's gonna be a little bit different, and I see both campaigns struggling to try to crack the code on how to reach the Latino community, just because it's not a full monolithic area where you can just say, sure, this is the one issue that affects them all. No, it's so many different issues. One thing that also plays a part in it, and I'm going to speak from the side, for example, from Puerto Ricans, as American citizens, and after Maria, we have a lot of Puerto Ricans that move to the States. So they automatically become voters the minute they register as citizens. But our politics in Puerto Rico do not translate on a one-to-one to politics in the US. We don't align in Puerto Rico as Democrats or Republicans. So it's almost like a completely different ball game for us. Our parties in Puerto Rico, they align more into like our state relationship with the US. So whether you want to become a state, just keep a status quo, indifferent relationship, or independence. So when they come here, it's not like, oh yeah, sure, they will register as X or Y. So that makes it really hard also to reach. So there's also the misconception that Puerto Ricans want statehood. And there is also a misconception Puerto Rican wants independence. Puerto Rican has been a colony since US acquired it back in the 50s. And Puerto Ricans have never had an opportunity to have a self-determination process. So it's really, really hard. When we come here, you would assume that you would vote Republican just because in the end, we're very conservative. Yeah. But after
I think it underlines the fact that I mean, I know the Republican Party had a huge, great big inquiry into how it was going to change the votes change the way it dealt with the Latino vote and how it can try and turn to them and appeal to them. But it seems to have done a very bad job, you know, under Trump. The signs have been particularly negative with, you know, obviously the construction of the wall. Malcolm, you chip in. We've got to come to Q&A in just a minute, but Malcolm, you go ahead. I think you've got a few questions to ask.
Yeah, so Eduardo, you mentioned Maria, and that's just to remind our audience that that's the hurricane that so badly devastated the island. The US federal response was much criticized. There was some widely lampooned video of President Trump, who flew in briefly, lambasted local officials, and was seen tossing, I think, toilet paper or kitchen towel into a crowd of
paper towels, but it's just as bad.
I think we lost you there slightly, Malcolm. We'll just wait for him to. We'll come back to Malcolm in a second. But let's start bringing in the questions while we're here. And a second ago, I know that we had Graham. I'm just trying to see if we got him up here actually. And I seem to have lost the question here too. The question was to Teresa, and do you see Donald Trump as a Republican, Teresa?
I did type a quick answer to that. I don't see him as a Republican. I see him as someone who is very self-serving, to be honest. However, I do think that many people in the Republican Party recognize, well, he's the Republican we have. He is the most visible Republican, and so we have to work from within. Having said that, I think the party in itself I believe it's going to take many years and much reinvention to repair the damage that's been done in the last 4 years. I don't think I don't call myself a Republican anymore, and I doubt I would be voting Republican again unless something dramatically changes.
That's an amazing conclusion. Malcolm, it goes back to your interview with Ben. So do you want to take up from there, Malcolm? You're back again. I hope we have you there.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me this time. But I guess the corollary to all of this, as we sort of look a little further down the line, is that presumably, you know, the Democratic Party is also going to take a look at how it tries to hang on to the support of people like Teresa. So, I mean, what would the Democrats have to do? I guess is a question for Teresa, and maybe Eduardo could also take this. What would they have to do down the line? Say, assuming Joe Biden wins, and you know he's likely to have a more unifying message than the incumbent. You know, you'd presumably want some outreach on the Republican side. And Eduardo, what would you be able to tolerate in terms of, you know, concessions made to a more conservative worldview in order to pull in and retain people like Teresa?
Eduardo, what's it going to take? I mean, what does the Democratic Party have to do to bring in more Latino voters? I mean, I know we've tried not to depict that as one particular bloc, but if they are going to try and appeal to, you know, more Hispanic voters, particularly in places like Texas, what's going to have to be done? If you can step outside of the Puerto Rican angle.
Yeah, so I think for the Latino voters, there are many angles that to be taken. A lot of Latinos, like I was saying earlier, they tend to be conservatives, and they tend to be, they fit the Republican bill. And it's even weird because even like on the case of immigration, not every Latino is for free and open borders the way that some liberals will try to portray. So I think it's trying to strike that balance between, yes, we're a nation that fear gods. Yes, we're a nation that we have immigration reforms, but the laws must be upheld. So it's a matter, I believe that the striking balance would be an immigration reform that would allow access to those that want to come to this country and want to work in a legal way, in a way that fits the bill for both sides, while at the same time, not just going to an extreme left. That's the way that I see it, especially when you bring the issues of Texas. Texas has a very different community than the one that we have here from the established Latinos there. The Latinos that they come and they arrive here in our country, they come from a different background. They come here and these are hardworking individuals. They just want to come here. They just want to work, and they want to do it in a very lawful way. These are one of the best neighbors that we have in the county. And a lot of us are worried about them, and a lot of us want them to be inclusive and feel part of this nation. So again, it's not the one size fits all. For us in the county, we want our neighbors to not fear that they're going to be deported. We want our neighbors to feel that they're a part of this community, that they're contributing to it with their taxes, with their vote, with their voice, and everything else that they're doing.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Eduardo. Ben, it's really good to have you on the line there. I can just see your face up there. I was really interested in what you were saying about Texas becoming a Republican state. And perhaps the way in which you were talking was suggesting, well, look, forget all the doom and gloom about Trump. The United States is becoming far more liberal. There's the growth of the suburbs. People are getting more and more educated. You know, Trumpism is going to be a thing of the past. Is it really that simple?
Well, I wouldn't say Trumpism is going to be a thing of the past. I think you're seeing states like Texas and Arizona moving towards the Democrats because there's large urban centers that are driving those votes in those states. But in the industrial Midwest, we're still seeing states move away from us. And I think a state like Pennsylvania, for example, this will probably be the last election in my lifetime where Pennsylvania will vote to the left of a state like Arizona. And it may be the last one that Pennsylvania votes to the left of a state like Texas, because we're seeing losses in those states, whether it be a Pennsylvania, an Ohio, a Michigan, a Wisconsin. And while we'll temporarily pick some of those back up this year because of Joe Biden, you're going to see them underperform the national Democratic vote, where historically they've always been to the left of the national Democratic vote, which is really the warning sign that everyone should be looking for.
That's amazing. And that points to this huge split between the new economy, which is providing jobs for educated workers and high salaries, and those people who are being left behind.
Well, yeah, and I think, as I said earlier, it very much speaks to what's going on all over the globe, where low-income workers, especially those who are historically union workers that are considered part of progressive coalitions, are moving away from progressive politics because of the loss of jobs and globalization, and higher income areas that are gaining from this and benefiting from it. You're seeing historically more conservative leaning voters becoming liberal.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I do want to get people's questions to come in here. I can't see all the questions on my screen at the moment. So, but if you can start, people can start typing them. And what we do, just for those of you who are sort of new to this, we promote people to a panelist. They open their microphone and they can put their questions to you directly. I want to bring in Dave Swenson, who's our sort of house analyst, as it were. Dave, do you want to follow up with any questions to Ben and what you've been hearing, or indeed to Stephen Farnsworth, who was speaking earlier? Dave.
Well, not so much a question. I'm absolutely fascinated with both of their perspectives and presentations. One of the things I want to reemphasize that does fit into what Ben just was talking about, as well as Dr. Farnsworth, is that I had told you that I'd done some research earlier in the year, or a couple of years ago, where if we look at a decade's worth of change in the United States, 99% of job growth, 99% of population growth occurred in metropolitan cities, and just 1% was shared among all of the non-metropolitan areas. And of course, there's variations within those areas. And the Midwest and the Northeast underperformed, and the South and the West overperformed in those numbers. And that's telling you where the growth is occurring. But what is that growth? Well, we already have had the hints. Most of that growth that's driving that metropolitan growth is access to high tech, high quality, high education jobs, and or it's also a lot of demand for service sector jobs, which tend to be young people and minorities. And you have this barbell of growth that's going on at the ends of the skills spectrum that's driving the growth in these areas. And both of those categories tend to vote, and more increasingly are voting Democratic, but it varies quite a lot across the region. So what I'm trying to do is just simply validate, I think, from research that I've been doing, that that's indeed the case.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this area, looking at Fairfax, so fascinating. Tomorrow we're going to be in Fauquier County, which is a more, I mean, Stephen, correct me on this, a more sort of a traditional conservative rural suburb. Is that right, Stephen? How would you describe Fauquier?
Yeah, what you have in Fairfax is what I would think of as kind of an inner ring suburban community. It was an area that was significantly impacted by the white flight movement of the 60s and the 70s. And then as it becomes a jobs hub, you see more and more people of all kinds of backgrounds choosing it as their home. The people who may have been the first wave of suburbanization, they move because they want a lot of land. They move maybe because they want a place where their conservative politics, they can find neighbors who would agree with them. But the second wave of suburbanization, people who maybe don't live in big houses, but rather in they're younger people, maybe living in townhouses or smaller houses. These are people who are moving more with respect to the issue of being close to jobs, being close to mass transit. And, you know, the economic message is much more likely to resonate with such voters than a Christian conservative message. The more libertarian vision of republicanism, I think, works much better in a place in the suburbs than the message that would be the more conservative message in a rural area. With Fauquier, you have something that is really kind of a little bit of both. You have some growth in Fauquier, but you still have a largely traditional conservative element in terms of Fauquier politics. And so you really are looking at sort of maybe where Fairfax was 40 or 50 years ago when you look at Fauquier today.
Yeah, well, I've got two questions off the back of that then. So this is one, well, first is Teresa. Would you vote for someone like Mitt Romney? Just straight off, Teresa.
I'm not sure at this point. I'm not
Would
sure.
you have done previously? Would you have done previously?
Yes, I probably would have.
Yeah. Okay. And because the small government thing, which is the thing that really appeals to you.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's go back to Ben, and maybe Ben, you're not the best person because you're a Democrat strategist, but is it possible for the Republicans to come up with that kind of conservatism again? Can they actually change themselves and address that? Or is that there's no future in that? I'm just trying to see what the alternatives are for the Republicans going beyond this election.
Yeah, I think the populist Republican message that Trump has brought to their party is going to be something they're going to have to continue. I would just add as a quick side note to your last question on Fairfax versus Fauquier, I think the actual slogan for some of the Board of Supervisors candidates in Fauquier last year was "Don't Fairfax Fauquier." So that was actually what they were running on. That was on their yard signs, and I think that it really speaks to the urbanization of Fairfax and what they're looking to avoid in some of these areas that are still more rural in Virginia, that they don't want to be urbanized like that. One other just side note that I think is important, is a unique thing when you're talking about Fairfax County. The first wave of minority voters that came to the county actually were very conservative. Fairfax County had a very, very low African-American population, but the first two waves of minority voters that came here there's a large Vietnamese population that came here after the Vietnam War. Actually, the South Vietnamese that were fleeing that settled in eastern Fairfax County. It's one of the largest homes of Vietnamese voters in the country. And then there's a large number of Korean voters that came after that were all coming from South Korea. Obviously, very few people can get out of North Korea. And so both of those sets of voters were actually very socially conservative and very Republican leaning when they arrived in the county, and still are more Republican leaning than the minority vote overall. But what's happened in the last 25 years is when you talk about the minority vote, you got to remember we're talking about a lot of different types of diversity. And when you see an increase in the Latino population, an increase in the African-American population, those have been the groups that have been driving the minority community to become far, far more Democratic, as well as just the Republicans seeing losses even among some of their traditional voters as they get disgusted with.
But why wouldn't the Republicans appeal to the Latino community? It was socially conservative. Obviously Trump has not ingratiated himself with the wall, but generally, they had a strategy paper produced in, I think it was 2012, that said this is where their shift should be.
Look, Latino voters were a great source of votes for Republicans for years. They were majority Republican in the 90s in many places. It wasn't until the California initiatives to crack down on illegal immigration that targeted the Latino community in the 1990s that you saw the shifts start to happen there. As recently as 2000 and 2004, George W. Bush was getting well into the 40% among the Latino community and carrying the Latino community in a number of swing states. But when you have these policies in place where the Republicans are pushing so hard to demonize that community, and let's remember there are children in cages that are on the border right now. I think it makes it very difficult for voters to get past that, to hear about their other policy positions, say, for example, pro-life or something else that they might agree with, when they see the Republican Party just dehumanizing them as people.
Right, got it. So they need to get on beyond this thing. Please do put your questions in the column here to the right. And just a word to our panelists, please don't answer the question straight off, because what we like to do is bring the people in so they can put the question to you directly themselves. I know Malcolm's got more things to share with us and more questions to put to our panelists. Just to remind you, everyone, we've got Brian Graham online, who's from the Democratic Party in Fairfax County. We've got Dave Swenson, our own analyst. We've got Stephen Farnsworth, the professor of politics, who gave us that introduction. And we also have Ben Tribbett, the strategist who's just been speaking now. And not to forget, of course, Teresa Termina, who is the former Republican voter turned Democrat. Sounds like you've turned Democrat for some time to come. That seems to be a sort of quite a big shift. Are you surprised by that? I'm trying to understand why you think that's a fairly permanent shift.
I am surprised by it. And I don't know that I would describe myself as a lifelong Democrat moving forward. I think where I am is I am very tired of the polarization of politics and the two extremes, the far left of the Democrat Party and the far right of the Republican Party, controlling the narrative. I think there are many of us who are somewhere in the middle, whether left of center or right of center, And we would like to see our government work in a way that isn't zero-sum, winner take all. I think compromise is the basis on which our system was built, and we lost that along the way. And not only are we've lost it and we're doing winner take all, we're demonizing anyone who doesn't agree with us 100%. And that is no way to run anything. A business would fall if you ran like that. So I'm more troubled by anything else is just this catering to these extremes and then trying to find a way to the middle to win the election and then going back to your extremes. I'm really bothered by it. And I'm bothered by the fact that social media is designed in a way to cement those extremes and that people in the middle are being lost. And whether, no matter what you feel or what your economic status is, you feel lost. No one's representing you. I don't see change until people stop trying to win it all and start having a conversation that finds a compromise ground.
Yeah, I think it's something that's been seen all around the world, and we could talk to you about here in the UK, Brexit, which has been one of the big dividing points. And I even think with COVID, the debate about COVID has produced, vastly different opinions from, wearing a mask, which is even a sign of politics. Malcolm, you've got questions. Ben Tribbett is still here with us, and I love hearing Ben. Malcolm, you far away.
Yeah, a little bit of a news update for you, just to play my anchor role. I noticed that just while we've been talking, the Washington Post is reporting that 47 million Americans have already cast their votes in this election, which apparently exceeds all the early voting 4 years ago. So, with less than 2 weeks to go, that's a huge number. And I guess the question, particularly for the Dems, if Brian's is still listening, is, how he assesses the level of enthusiasm. I mean, I guess on one level, this indicates a highly energized electorate around here. If you get a lot of turnout, and you can probably still see there are still people lined up. They've got 59 more minutes to cast their early ballots just for today, and then it resumes tomorrow. But the question for Brian, the Democrats, I did notice, I can't quite reconcile. There's obviously a lot of people voting around here since it's fairly Dem heavy. That would seem to be a good thing for the Democrats. I saw very few, or comparatively few, yard signs and so on from it wasn't a scientific survey, but I drove around some neighborhoods and saw fewer than I might have expected given this apparent energy in the electorate. So I guess how to account for that is my short question with a long preamble.
Yeah, so Virginia, we have more than 1.5 million early votes, which is, like you said, more than ever. The thing that to me is an indicator that the polls are right this time, where they were wrong last time, is that 109,000 of those early votes not in Fairfax County, in Virginia, are people that did not vote in 2016. So if you look at those numbers of like who won between the Democrats, the Republicans, the people that won in 2016 were the people that didn't vote, right? The number of people that didn't vote was larger than either of the popular votes for the candidates. So that's, to me, an indicator of people were looking at the polls saying, well, Hillary's going to win 96% chance confidence or whatever. So I don't need to go vote. I don't really like either of them that much. I'm just going to sit at home and not do anything. But I think this time people have resolved. My parents are Republicans. I don't tell anyone that, but they didn't vote in 2016, but find Biden palatable. So there's definitely kind of a general thing. The yards, I don't know if the yard signs mean anything. We've given out tens of thousands of yard signs in Fairfax County. Fairfax County is a little bit different because we keep them off the roads. Based off of ordinance, but keeps things a little bit cleaner, I guess.
Okay, and then I had a question sort of arising from this for Stephen. How many undecided voters are there out there? And it sort of boggles the mind in this environment that there might still be undecided voters, but we are told that they exist. Like the dodo, I haven't seen one, but apparently they exist. How many are there? Are they quantifiable?
Well, it's a tiny sliver of the electorate, really. Generally speaking, presidential elections in the United States, when there's an incumbent president running, there are a referendum on that incumbent, and people have had 4 years to see Donald Trump, and they like what they see or they do not. There are very few people who are lukewarm. We'd be talking about the low single digits in terms of the truly undecided. People might tell pollsters that they're undecided because that's a civically desirable response. But the reality is that we're talking about maybe one voter in 30 or something like that. And those people are a question mark whether they would even participate. If you look at the truly independent voters, they are low knowledge voters, they are low interest voters, and that means they may not be voters who appear in this process at all. One other thing I want to mention, there's a new set of rules in Virginia this election cycle that is making it much easier for people to vote absentee and much easier to register to vote. And so in addition to people feeling like it might be safer to vote separate from the traditional election day standing in line experience, there's also the fact that the Democratic majorities in Virginia in the legislature have set up new state laws that have made it more appealing. And that's one of the things that's really kind of weird about the American political system, in that so much of these decisions are handled at state capitals, not national capitals. And so when they're making decisions about whether you can drop your ballot off at one place or another, these are decisions being made at on a state-by-state basis. And so what happens at the sub-presidential level can have a real big impact if you're thinking about how easy it is to vote in Georgia or Texas or other places.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks very much for that. It'll be interesting to see when we're in North Carolina next week, where the process of voting has been a bit more complicated with debates about restrictions on voting and how voting takes place. Piers Reynolds, you've got a question. So Piers, go ahead. Go on.
The Twitter campaigns of Trump and Trump Jr. seem extraordinarily negative to me for an incumbent, with themes like the Biden crime family, Obamagate, which I've been totally unable to figure out what it's all about, and the Democrats as far left radical militants. Is any of this having an impact beyond Trump's core base?
Ben, do you want to answer that?
Sure. First of all, I think when you look at Twitter and you look at the Trump campaign and the messages they're putting out, the Trump campaign has a lot of expertise in projection, and the messages that they put out tend to be the things they feel they are the most vulnerable to. So I think that the Biden crime family is really something that they feel vulnerable to as messaging against themselves. And you see that consistently with all of their messaging, that a lot of times when you see them start to take on a new message, it's because a bad story is coming on that topic in the next week or 2 weeks, and you can see it coming. And so, is it having an impact? No. First of all, Twitter doesn't have an impact. When you see a tweet that takes off outside of fundraising, Twitter has low impact on fundraising, but when you see a tweet take off with 10,000 retweets, remember there's 435 congressional districts in the country. And we're talking about that's averaging 25 people per congressional district. Most precincts have 400 or 500 votes cast in them for each side at a minimum. So you're talking about just the tiniest sliver of the electorate, even for the most viral of tweets. 98% of Americans are not on Twitter. And so, but it is a place
matters, Ben? I mean, is it sort of local news? I mean, obviously there's a huge number of sources people get their news from. So what you're saying is, what is influential? It's the networks. That story gets taken up by the networks.
I don't think that those stories are getting, the reporters have become a lot more sophisticated to covering Trump than they were at the start of the Trump administration. At the start of this administration, you saw people picking up the messages that they put out and repeating and amplifying them, and then asking the Democrats to respond. And I think that the most reporters have figured out that amplifying things that they know to be lies and asking the other side to respond is not actually journalism. And you've seen them change the way that they've gone about covering Trump because of that. And because of the amount of lies that come out in a single day, it's very hard for reporters to keep up with it. I think what Trump is doing is changing politics forever. I think a lot of what he's doing actually works very well. It just hasn't worked well for him because he's done such an incompetent job on issues. But in terms of keeping the other side on the defensive, he's done an excellent job for the last 4 years of keeping the Democratic Party on the defensive every single day.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, Sheila de Beleg, and then Philip Godfrey, and then also Lynn Maddock again. So let's take Sheila first. Go on, Sheila.
How important are the televised debates between the candidates, given that so many people have already voted? And as Dr. Farnsworth said, there are so very few undecided voters.
Brian, do you want to take that? I mean, that's John Brian.
Sure. I mean, I don't think they're very important. I mean, they do. We have seen a little bit in polls that Donald Trump actually ends up going down after the debate, or I mean, the one debate we've had so far, I guess, just based on. And he also had a kind of town hall thing. But we have our next one in a couple hours. I'm sure you all will be asleep by then. But typically, I mean, I kind of expect Donald Trump to do something kind of stupid or just kind of look like an idiot, basically.
Isn't it fear that something goes wrong with Joe Biden? I mean, I keep saying this. We saw Joe Biden live in Des Moines, Iowa, and all of us on that group we did a political tour for the caucuses. All of us basically said, this guy's going to lose. This guy could not last a campaign. So isn't the risk is that he could have a bad night?
I certainly, I guess that's a risk. I think he's done pretty well so far in the debates, or at least well enough. He basically just needs to be kind of non-controversial, a non-controversial option, and let the story be about how Trump is not acceptable.
Okay, Philip Godfrey, go on, Philip.
Nicholas, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, go on.
You've stolen my thunder, because my question was exactly the point you've just made, which is to the panel, what could go wrong? Despite your leanings, Democratic leanings for most of the panelists, what could go wrong tonight in the debates? As you said, Nicholas, we watched Biden in Iowa and we all thought this is a train crash waiting to happen. I think perhaps the panelists have answered this, but it's a serious point, because he has been somewhat protected from his electorate. He's got away with having a very, very aggressive first debate, which in a funny way played to Biden's weaknesses, because he didn't have to string a sentence together because Trump didn't give him the opportunity to do. And then the second debate was lost. So this third debate, is he going to be exposed for being mentally not as acute as he might be? And would it make any difference at this stage?
Ben, go on.
Yeah, well, first of all, the election's a choice between the two people on the ballot, and the idea that in one debate that Biden could expose himself to be more mentally unstable or insecure or whatever than Donald Trump, I think is absurd. And I think that, after seeing Trump for 4 years, I think that he's driving this electorate. I really don't know what Joe Biden could do tonight to lose voters. Most voters aren't voting for Joe Biden, right? They're voting against Donald Trump. And so how do you lose those voters? Now, I do think that what you will see tonight is Trump trying to recast his record, because his record is the problem. And I think that's going to be the main goal of the Trump campaign tonight, and trying to recast his record, especially on the coronavirus, to be seen as being successful. I don't think it's possible at this point. I do think months ago, he had an opportunity to change this election fundamentally. And if he had taken the approach that so many other leaders around the world have done by taking this virus very seriously and behaving like a president should behave in terms of taking this seriously, I actually think he could have won back a lot of these Republican voters that have left him by showing that he was up for the job. I don't think at this point anyone would believe in the last 2 weeks that he's going to be up for the job after what we've seen for the last 6 months and the amount of suffering that people have had because of it.
Teresa, how do you feel about voting for a 77-year-old?
Joe Biden is who he is. He, even when 10 years ago, 20 years ago, he's never been a great debater. He's never been a great public speaker. He does fumble and bumble at times. Is his mental acuity as strong as it was 20 years ago? I'm not sure, but looking at the alternative, I'll take that versus what we've seen for the last 4 years. And I agree with what was just said. People are not voting necessarily for Biden, although I think he's perfectly fine. And I like the man. I actually think he's a decent human being. They're voting against Trump if you're a Republican voting. And I can't take 4 more years of Trump. And I don't think anything can happen tonight that would change my point of view. I've already voted, so it doesn't matter anyway. But even then, there's nothing that could happen tonight that would make me regret my vote.
Fine is sort of the word of the year.
Say it again.
Joe Biden is fine is sort of the word of the year. He's fine.
Yeah.
It's not, people aren't excited, but he's fine.
He's fine.
Well,
okay.
I've made the point before, but let me reprise it anyway, that also the Republicans have somewhat shot themselves in the foot by making Biden appear so bumbling and fumbling that every time he stands up and strings a sentence together, it seems like it's so counterintuitive to what they've said that it seems like a triumph. And so as a strategy, it doesn't seem super successful.
Yeah. Let's bring in Neil Fleming and then Lynn Maddock. These are our last two questions. Neil Fleming, if you could go ahead. I'm hoping that Neil's sound is going to work because it hasn't worked in the past 4 programs. Go ahead, Neil. No, no sound. It's like the running gag. So I'm going to read Neil Fleming's. Neil's in Australia. We've got a lot of people in Australia listening in. And Neil says, our Florida panelists suggested that pollsters, and these were Republican pollsters, the pollsters have got it wrong again, that sufficient potential voters have not been assessed legitimately, i.e. really supporting Trump, but not expressing that directly. That's not likely to apply to Virginia, but what about more swing states? And I think there was one pollster who was more Florida-based, but also there's an article in the National Review, which I did share with people watching today, which was from the Trafalgar Group. Ben, are you familiar with them and their polling methods?
Yes.
So what's your take on that? Because, in 2016, all the major polls got it wrong, and that they didn't know how to assess the blue-collar workers, people who were dismayed with former Democratic voters. They were not taken seriously by the polls. They weren't counted properly. But why is it right this time?
Well, first of all, the polling in 2016, it was far better than what people remember it to be, because remember, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. And so I think the national poll average was a point off of what the final results were.
Yeah, but we all know it's not the national polls. The polls within the swing states that count, isn't it?
Well, but I think part of what happened in 2016 was no one expected some of the swing states to be swing states. So Michigan and Wisconsin were actually completely underpolled as well. And quality pollsters were not going into there. There was a couple point differential in Pennsylvania, but the polls were not dramatically bad in 2016. What was bad was how the polls were read, and that people assumed that Hillary Clinton was operating with this blue wall behind her that couldn't be penetrated, and the blue wall was. Had that blue wall in the upper Midwest not been penetrated, she would be president of the United States right now. And remember, it was very small margins in those states. In terms of this year, I think the polling is showing a dramatic shift everywhere. In most congressional districts that we're working in that are in suburbs, we're seeing 10 to 15 point moves from 2016. These are not within the margin of error. They're dramatic. And it aligns very closely with what we saw in the midterms in 2018. And so all of the data suggests that this is real. The early vote numbers suggest it's real. And I'm usually a pessimist in these elections. I'm usually someone who is the person who's hiding in the corner, waiting to lose. But in this case, I think this is the safest bet that we have had in my lifetime. Joe Biden is not only going to win, he's going to win in a historic landslide. And the only question is whether he'll get 400 electoral votes or not.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, Lynn Maddock, last question. If you're there, Lynn, go on.
Thanks, Nicholas. Just a bit of one from left field. We hear that the Dems, if they win the Senate, are likely to vote for Puerto Rico and DC to become states and hence have Senate seats. I don't know whether that's realistic, whether it could beat the filibuster, etc. But having a president who wouldn't overrule such an outcome could be attractive to Puerto Ricans in particular. Is it realistic? Is it attractive? Will it change the vote?
Okay, go on, Eduardo. You know the answer to this, if you can, briefly.
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, so Puerto Ricans are not all pro-statehood. We don't know that. There have been many plebiscites in the past, and they have been like botched by the local government, the local party, ruling. So we don't know if Puerto Ricans want statehood or not. There's a plebiscite coming on Puerto Rican elections, which coincide with the U.S. presidential elections. It's the same day, it's November 4th, that there will be a non-binding plebiscite where Puerto Ricans will vote yes statehood or not. And I say non-binding because if the answer is yes, it means nothing in Congress. Congress is not endorsing this. The President Trump himself has said that he will not give Puerto Ricans the vote. So it is my opinion, and I'm just speaking as one voter. Is I don't know that would necessarily be happening. I can see DC becoming a state before Puerto Rico does, and it's very different atmosphere. Even if you talk to the Congress woman representative for the district for DC, she will be the one to tell you Puerto Rico and DC are not the same. We're very much different. So will having the two senators from Puerto Rico and the district is something that the Democrats want. I think that that's a bet that a lot of politicians could be making. And like I said earlier, Puerto Ricans do not align with Democrats or Republicans. So it could be something that you give them the two senators and all of a sudden you have two Republican senators. Okay. So I don't know that it's a done deal.
Okay. Yeah, I think the big fear is about which way those entities would go, and certainly Washington's seen as a Democratic stronghold, and so there's been a lot of opposition to that idea because of that. I'm going to say thank you very much to all our panelists. We had a great commitment from all of you. Thank you very much indeed. That from Benjamin Tribbett, from Eduardo Conde, we've had Dave Swenson. Dave is going to stay on the line. Teresa Tomino, who was the voter, was absolutely fascinating listening to you, Tomino. And of course, our colleagues as well from the Democratic Party as well. And that was Brian Graham and Jack Corrali. Jack, who had to leave earlier. Tomorrow, we are going to be in Fauquier County, which is a much smaller community of voters, but it is as important in a way because it
Sorry, I think Nicholas has left us very briefly.
Well, I could pick up from there. I mean, he was winding up, but we are going to Fauquier County tomorrow. As he was starting to say, it's a smaller county, as Dr. Farnsworth was telling us too. More conservative. It's interesting, particularly because you drive a short distance down I-66, which is just close to me here, and the politics change pretty dramatically over a course of half an hour's drive, basically. So we'll get a flavor of there. We'll be in the town of Warrenton and some other places. There'll be some nice fall scenery, autumn scenery for you. And we look forward to talking to you all then. So thanks very much for joining us tonight, all the panelists and all of the participants.
Just to get a few thoughts from people while they're listening in, we've got Dave there, and I just want to get a few thoughts from Dave Swenson, straight off the back of all of that. That was we had a huge number of people. I think Eduardo's still there, still listening in, which is great. But Dave, your thoughts listening to that?
Well, you had such a range of issues. It was absolutely fascinating listening to Teresa as she worked her way through what's going on with how she's thinking, how she views this. I found it really interesting because as I have grown up over the years to learn about conservatism, hers seemed to represent the kind of conservatism I remember. And however it might have changed over time, that seemed to be the brand of conservatism. And to listen to her her complaint was an absence of philosophy. I mean, she had many other complaints, but she kept bringing that up, an absence of philosophy. And it's making me wonder right now the degree to which ideological foundations that we hold dear, values, sets of values, how we articulate those values, our ethics, which basically are putting our morals into practice, how they translate into political ideas and political choices. And so I found that very, very interesting. And Eduardo's, again, I'm telling you, I'm sitting here learning about Puerto Rico and the fact that it is Puerto Rico and not something that we're trying to make it. Has also been very, very good because we tend to put our thumbs on different territories and or ethnic groups and we basically say, you're this and you're that. And again, learning that has been fascinating to me. And then I need to go all the way to the beginning. The fantastic maps that showed the bulging blue in northeastern Virginia and the transformation of this region, which is something that we've been watching if you listen to the radio, I listen to NPR, and you hear about Fairfax County and the dynamism of that county. And then now it's going to get Amazon 2 or 2.3 or whatever it is that they're getting, and it's going to transform even more rapidly. This has just been a fascinating discussion, and so I get to watch this without having to pay. So this is really good.
But the other point was there, David, this is something I know that you're very interested in, is what Ben spoke about. He said that, yes, the suburbs are expanding, but you're going to see areas, former manufacturing areas, places that were blue collar, like Pennsylvania, move away from the Republicans. And that reflects this change
from the Democrats.
In the economy. Sorry.
Yeah, he said they would move away from, yes.
Move away from Democrats, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of flux. 15 years ago, Pittsburgh, and we were writing off Pittsburgh as basically a failed city. And then now Pittsburgh's remade itself. So that's Pennsylvania. And so again, I'm back to this thing. Where is the growth occurring? We have the strong growth in the metropolitan areas, the strong dynamism in metropolitan restored economies. Many of the Midwestern economies aren't restoring rapidly, but growth that is occurring in those Midwestern economies is nonetheless occurring in and around these metropolitan areas. And to write those areas off as failing and or completely and irrevocably declining is, I believe, an overstatement. They are going through a period of transition in the Midwest and in some of these areas. And that period of transition very well may mean that they stay red or near red or solid red, for that matter, for a period of time. But again, the dynamism of those economies as they're changing is the movement from people from the rural areas and the small areas repopulating those urban areas. And the people that are doing the moving are younger and higher educated. And the people that are stuck back in their other places tend to be the reverse. They're older and less educated. And so the gap between those metropolitan growth areas and those rural areas or non-metropolitan areas that aren't growing is going to grow larger over time.
Yeah. I'm going to see Sheila de Blague's name in front of me, and I'm going to pick on you, Sheila. Did you feel more positive hearing some of that? I mean, we've had a lot of doom and gloom over the past 4 years, and Fairfax County seemed to suggest that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Sheila, are you there? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I am.
Go on, Sheila. Go on.
I am. Yes, yeah. No, it was cheering, and hearing was it Brian who was most enthusiastic?
Ben Tribbett, yeah.
No, Ben. Yes. I was quite amazed by that, and I just hope. Well, I hope they're right, but nobody asked how many shy Trump voters there might be around who were not going to.
Well, I think he said that the shy Trump voters were being exaggerated, and certainly exaggerated by the pollsters we had spoken to on Monday in Florida, who suggested that 2020 was going to be a rerun of 2016. Yeah. But he said, no, don't listen to them. Yeah. The polls are pretty accurate.
Well. I'm a bit with the suburban housewife who was feeling quite nervous about the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Malcolm, we need to wrap it up. But what's the situation with there? Is voting coming to a close behind you?
Yeah, it's got another half an hour to go. People have been, drifting past after work, I guess. And yeah, there's been a steady line, several hundred since we've been here. I just wanted to mention one other thing, which was sort of very left field, but it's worth paying attention to, because we were talking about Twitter and its potency in this election and so on. And I was just inclined to think that maybe we occasionally sort of, perhaps me because of my age, we're not looking always at where people are communicating. And I just wanted to flag up one thing to pay some attention to. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the sort of famous or infamous, depending on whether you like her or not, AOC, as she's often known here, the member of Congress from Brooklyn. She participated in a Twitch video game this week. So Twitch is a platform where you can watch other people play video games. And 400,000 people were watching that. That is crazy. So, Donald Trump has a large Twitter following, sure, But, you know, this is a channel that we're not paying any attention to. You know, can I tell you that it's having a transformative political impact? I have no idea. But, you know, most politicians would give their eye teeth to have any form of direct communication with 400,000 voters, and most likely young voters. So that's my sort of reporter's notebook. Pay some attention to this. I'm not quite sure what it means, but it's interesting. Thought.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed for that, Malcolm. I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow. I think in a way, Fairfax County was a sort of Dem fest. It was very, very positive news for the Democrats. And we're going to get a very different perspective tomorrow. And that's going to be really, really interesting and a strong contrast to today. So thank you very much indeed, Malcolm. Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you very much, everybody else, for joining us. And I do hope we can sort out Neil Fleming's microphone's problems by tomorrow.
Please send help.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.